All right. Hello, and a very warm welcome to our event tonight. We thank everyone very much for participating tonight. My name is Franziska Schmitdtke. I am the head of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung office in Thuringia and the host of this event tonight. As you noticed, I will speak in English, but there will be a German translation, so please check the audio if you are on the wrong side of the translation at the moment. Let me say, this is a very special event for us. As you can imagine, our main audience is usually based in Thuringia or spread across Germany, but an international audience is quite rare. So thanks again for joining us tonight. We are collaborating tonight with the FES office in Washington, D.C., and I'd like to thank my colleagues at the FES United States of America and Canada office, especially Kim Pankin, who helped to make this event tonight possible. I would, of course, also like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss, who is about to present the results of her study on the female face of right-wing populism and extremism in the United States. Her study is part of a series called Triumph of Women, which includes a series of country analysis. So if you're interested in the series, please check out the website that Michael is now also posting in the chat. Most of the studies are in German, but I think a few of them are also translated into English. So if you're interested in right-wing populism and a gendered form of right-wing populism in Germany, in Austria, in Great Britain, then you're very welcome to check out those reports. This brings me to a few more preliminary comments. First of all, by now, I think we are all probably very used on being on Zoom, on being on the screen, and I think we all have a good idea how Zoom is working. We are all accustomed to it by now. But however, if you have any technical issues, I'd like to refer you to Michael Schwabe. He's our technical support for tonight, and he can help you out if you have any problems. Please contact him directly via chat if there are any issues or if you require any help. Secondly, after Cynthia's presentation, we'd like to invite you also to join into our discussion. You can use the chat for questions and comments. And if you're watching the live stream on our website, then you should also be able to ask questions via feedback. I will do my best to raise all the questions you asked to Cynthia, but please bear with me if we are not able to answer all of your questions tonight. Maybe we'll just do a second round. So now, with no further ado, please let me introduce now Cynthia. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is the director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she's also a professor at the School of Public Affairs. She is a well-known author and scholar on the topics of radicalization and extremism. Among her scholarly work are two books that I would like to mention here. First of all, The Extreme Gone Mainstream. This one is a pivotal analysis of commercialization and far-right youth culture in Germany. Through many years and of research and back and forth between Germany and the US, Cynthia was able to produce this really very insightful empirical book that really helps us to understand the main shifts within far-right youth culture. Secondly, I would like to mention Hate in the Homeland, the most recent book Cynthia published. Hate in the Homeland presents a startling look at places where violent hate groups recruit young people. Maybe later on we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about the findings of the book, as it is really also very interesting because it lays some groundwork for how we think about far-right movements. If you are actually interested in purchasing the book, there is a promotional code that Cynthia has shared with us. You can see it right now, but we will also share the code on the chat. In addition to her professorship at the American University, Cynthia is also involved in some of the most renowned research institutes on the far right around the world, such as the Center for Research on Extremism in Oslo, or the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, which is, I think, based in the UK, in London. And if that's not enough, she's also regularly asked by the media for her assessment of current events in regard to the far right, of course. And as a result, she's also a sought-after scholar on policy development. She has testified before the US Congress and regularly briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies in the United States, the United Nations, and other countries. Really, there are many more credentials I could add, but since you don't want to hear my voice anymore, but I think you're interested in hearing what Cynthia will present to us now, I will end my remarks and give the floor to Cynthia. Just one last thing. Cynthia will speak for about 25 minutes now and share a presentation with us. Afterwards, we will have plenty of time for questions, remarks, and further discussion. So now, Cynthia, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to have you, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Franziska. Thank you all for coming, and also thank you to Michael Schwabe and the FES, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung here in the US and Canada for inviting me to write this report originally, and then also for participating in this talk, and also with gratitude to Peter, who is translating my words. Although I do speak German, it's quite rusty, and I am grateful to have a professional translation instead of subjecting you all to my rough German right now. I learned a lot from writing this report. It was really a pleasure last summer to spend the summer reading and really digging deep into some of the gender dimensions that led to Trumpism, so a bit more of the more recent history. And so I'm going to share my screen and use some slides to walk through. Here we go. Okay. I hope you can see that. So as Franziska mentioned, the report itself, this case study about the US, is available in German and English. And my talk will pretty closely follow the report itself. So I will just be able to, in 25 minutes, really touch on some of the highlights from the report, but I would encourage you, of course, to read it if you're interested in diving deeper into any more of it. So one of the animating questions for the report really had to do with white women's support for Trump, women's support in general, but white women's support in particular. So over 40% of women voted for Trump in 2016. I'll talk later just a little bit about the 2020 election, but a majority of white women voted for him as well. And so one of the questions was, he had made sexist and misogynistic remarks. In many ways, the comments that he made, as well as his own behavior, kind of spoke against the family values that many evangelical Christians who support him ostensibly, support. And so there was this sort of puzzling contradiction about women's support when there was a woman candidate instead that they could have voted for. So why did so many women support him instead of the woman candidate? And so what I talk about in the structure of the report argues that the explanation for their support for Trump hinges on 6 things, really. So 3 social movement developments first, which has to do with the history of the U.S. Tea Party and its role in mobilizing conservative women into politics. The evolution of politics within U.S. evangelical Christianity, and particularly around gendered dimensions of that. And finally, the importance of a decade-plus populist and anti-elite revival that was happening globally. I mean, not just in the U.S., but that really also, among other anti-elite and anti-university, anti-science kinds of arguments, honed in on gender itself, and an attack on kind of gender studies or gender ideology, as they call it often, as a very key dimension that sort of positioned traditional women's roles as against elite efforts to manipulate or to promote a kind of PC or politically correct framework. So I'll talk about that. But those things intersect with gender-related mobilization and a series of other categories that I talk about in this report, which includes themes around traditional motherhood and the protection of children's and families' futures, strong pro-life sentiments and anti-abortion sentiments, and interestingly, a redefinition of feminism, a kind of reframing of feminism around the idea of autonomy from government dependence. So a shift away from feminism as choice or as government regulated equality, and toward feminism itself as autonomy from government dependence. So I will talk about each of those things briefly in my 20 minutes or so. So the question, Sayward Darby puts this really nicely in her book that came out last year called Sisters in Hate, which is why would women organize against their own freedom? And there's sort of at least three major explanations that I discuss. The first is simply that most Americans vote along party lines, regardless of the candidate. So, and those loyalties, those party loyalties are also racialized. So a majority of white women have favored the Republican candidate in the last 3 elections, while most Black and Latina women supported Democrats. In fact, the last time a majority of white women voted for a Democratic nominee for president was in 1996, and that came after a 32-year gap since they had done that previously. So it would be very unusual for women, for anyone really, but especially here for white women, to vote for outside of their own party lines. And so that kind of this idea of traditional Republican themes, smaller government, plays a big role here. And any discomfort that women might have had with some of the misogynistic or sexist language or comments or behavior wasn't enough to overcome that. The second, and this is, a number of scholars have argued this, including in this New York Times op-ed piece by Alexis Grinnell, that the social positioning practices of white women motivated their vote as well, that this is still a system that benefits them relative to minority women. And so they voted in ways that reinforce their own privilege vis-a-vis minority women. And so I think that's, this idea that this gender gap in politics is really a color line, is what Alexis Grinnell argues is an important factor here. And finally, there were some really interesting gendered frameworks going on in the patterns of voting among conservative women, who in many ways felt validated by some of the traditional language, the calls for a kind of 1950s era utopian ideal that reinforced traditional homemakers' roles. And I think it plays a really important role here that this isn't just about Trump himself positioning or reinforcing, or the campaign reinforcing traditional women's roles, But there was also the fact that Hillary Clinton was seen as openly hostile to traditional homemakers' roles. And that wasn't as much in the campaign as it had been in previous very public blunders that she had made. So a 1992 campaign comment when she said she wasn't the kind of woman who stayed home and baked cookies, or a 60 Minutes interview where she said she wasn't sitting here like some little woman standing by my man. So there has long been an understanding and some hostility directed toward Hillary Clinton, and a sense that she judges or looks down on women who do not pursue professional careers, but would opt for a more traditional family role. And so in many ways, some of the vote for Trump among women was actually more of a vote against Hillary Clinton. So in other words, gender itself wasn't as important as it was a sense that even though Hillary Clinton is a woman, that she was very much as a liberal feminist, counter or arguing counter to the kinds of frameworks that these women in the conservative and evangelical space valued. Now, this comes, of course, very much on the heels of the Tea Party itself, which I think is really important to understand. And the Tea Party, didn't get Trump elected, but it's an incredibly important factor in understanding how conservative women mobilized in the years leading up to the Trump administration. The Tea Party emerged in the US in 2009 out of conservative so-called Tea Party protest against the Obama administration's tax and homeowner relief policies. It drew on the metaphorical power of the American colonists' Boston Tea Party protests against the British colonial tax on tea. That's a event that has long lived in American history and myth as an event that sparked the American Revolution. So it became a symbol, and it remains a symbol of resistance to government tyranny, and the use of civil disobedience to foster resistance to that tyranny. So I could go on and on about what the Tea Party was, or how it, they used a lot of costumes. They developed they got a lot of strategic support from Republicans, but it was mobilized in some ways in a very grassroots way that was decentralized. So there were eventually over 1,000 local Tea Party groups across the country. And that grassroots organizational structure, the decentralized nature of that structure, enabled new modes of participation from women who had not been able to engage in political activism when it was more at the national level only. The Tea Party kind of relocated the location of political activism to more local groups. And that mobilized women who had built their lives around more traditional homemaking roles. So there was a blog, for example, called Moms for Sarah Palin, who was the former Alaska governor and one-time vice presidential candidate. And on that blog, argued that this was, that women like me, she wrote, stay at home and work from home moms got a voice through the movement. So the Tea Party movement kind of really made this space for women to engage more locally. And then added to that, Sarah Palin herself made a direct appeal to women within the Tea Party who, what she called mama grizzlies, mothers who would rise up against the government and protect their cubs and their families and their grandkids. And so it was this kind of framing of motherhood as a political act, or situating good motherhood as a political act within the Tea Party, that involved fighting back against this fiscal threat posed to families by big government that would imperil children's future. And that really mobilized women, but also helped to redefine and reshape sort of this mantle of feminism itself. So part of what the Tea Party did, and women within the Tea Party, was try to make an argument that liberal feminists had overemphasized reproductive rights and choice and government regulation of fairness. And they kind of reclaimed the mantle of feminism as as independence from government. And so that instead of what they call the patronizing approach of liberal feminists who lean into government regulation, that they were advocating for a version of feminism that would create more autonomy, lack of dependence on government, and give women more agency. And so that played a really important role in mobilizing women into conservative roles. Evangelical Christianity is the second of the three topics that I analyze here, and this idea that family values played a role, even though it's hard to understand the way that family values might intersect with, voting for someone who seemed to go against that. But Trump enjoys massive support from white evangelical voters, having gotten 81% of their support on Election Day in 2016. So pundits and the public alike had struggled to really understand how conservatives who were supporting and touting family values could support a candidate who seemed to flout those values. And so I think to understand that, you have to really understand that evangelicals themselves, many of them believe or have a strong belief that the country is on the wrong path and see threats to family values and traditional gender roles as coming from the liberal left, and see a need to combat moral degeneracy and evil and national decline all at once. So for many evangelicals, Trump was a candidate whose sort of bluster and promise to restore something, the kind of utopian promises, this idea that there was a nostalgic golden age that we could get back to and make America great again, that we'd go back to that place. This appealed to a lot of white and evangelical and conservative men and women who felt threatened by demographic or social change. So it maintained a very strong role. I mean, there's a lot of other aspects to it that I go into in the report, which I won't go into now, but that relate to kind of the masculinity, the manly bravado, the idea that Trump himself embodied American strength, that he would restore and fight for them, that that he might be reckless here and there, but that was part of the deal. And that he embodied the kind of strength that would project globally and would be a real leader and a real man. And so in that sense, I think it's important to understand that American voters did not necessarily rally around him despite this kind of masculine bluster, but rather because of it. And so they were actually attracted to it in some ways. And I think that militant masculinity kind of that is at the heart of a lot of evangelical support for Trump, that patriarchal authority and display of power was something that really appealed to a lot of people. The final category that I discuss in the report is this idea that I'm just going to move the screen here so your faces are blocking my my comments here. So that there has been in the U.S. and abroad, obviously a long populist trend that includes not just the ordinary people being positioned against the elite or some kind of bad or nefarious elite, but also anti-science itself. And a lot of that bluster and rhetoric targets gender itself, targeting social change that's come about with changing pronoun use, with transgender rights, with gender-neutral bathrooms. And university campuses in particular have been real targets for what's seen as a cultural Marxist plot, I put, in quotation marks, that the far right says is the shift away from a revolution of laborers into a revolution of ideas, and that kind of radical feminazis will emasculate men and usurp their rightful power. So there's this whole lengthy and long explanation I could go into there about the attacks on gender ideology, as it's often referred to, on gender studies as a field. So there's a lot of this idea that gender roles and traditional family values are being corroded, and that natural differences between the sexes are being eliminated or trying to be eliminated by the left. And so there's been some mobilization around transgender rights, around bathroom usage, protests, and all of that gets situated as part of a conservative attempt to protect family values. Universities themselves become very key in this because they're seen as promoting kind of cultural treason to Western civilization. So the report goes into greater length on this, but I think trying to understand that framework as part of what that there's a sort of culture war here related to gender, and that is part of what mobilizes. I also in the report go into, of course, not just the framings of why you have women supporting Trump or parties that might cut back on their own rights, but also what happened with those actual rights. And so what's the impact on the Trump administration's, what's their legacy on gender and reproductive rights? And so we do see that right away, the Trump administration begins to have immediate impact on gender and reproductive rights. Pence plays a role in this, of course, Mike Pence, because he himself was a devout evangelical Christian who was an outspoken advocate of a lot of these kinds of family rights and family values. But right away on the first day in office, the administration reinstated a Reagan-era policy called the Global Gag Rule, which stripped funding from any international non-governmental organizations that provide abortion services or even discuss abortion with women. And so it started right away, the scaling back of language, addressing rights, attacks on Planned Parenthood, challenges within the individual states. So again, this isn't just a federal effort, but challenges within state legislatures, which were emboldened, I think, by the Trump administration's move to restrict abortion. So in 2019, over 30 states introduced legislation to ban or restrict abortion within their states. And, there were new policies allowing employers and health insurers to deny birth control coverage if their reasons for doing so were religious and moral in nature. There were impacts on LGBTQ plus and transgender rights that I go into. But just to make the point that this isn't just about a framing of gender, but there were very real impacts on gender and reproductive rights. Finally, I think it's important to just talk about the fact that women also played a really important role in creating counter movements and successful strategies, both grassroots and spontaneous and kind of in planned and policy ways. So we saw broad resistance among women and men to the election, to Trump's campaign and language. You had sort of spontaneous dance parties and demonstrations outside of key administration officials' homes, even that tried to, the neighborhood that Pence was living in, for example, a lot of neighbors there waving the rainbow flag outside of their homes, for example, to support LGBTQ rights. We had massive mobilization from the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, which was in which women played a very key role. And then last summer, moms, the Wall of Moms, they called themselves, playing a role in really trying to engage in activism to prevent police violence and to protect protesters, as well as other forms of union support for those campaigns. And then we also had democratic mobilization that happened right away on the more formal level, creating campaigns like She Should Run, which encourage young women to run for office and to try to get more women into the pipeline who would lead to elections as well. There were also, of course, legal efforts, litigation and civil rights efforts to protest and restore some of the rights that were lost. The last thing I want to say is that, I wrote this before the 2020 election, but I did have a chance very briefly right after the election to make some concluding remarks as it went to press. And so I can reflect more on that in question and answer, but I will say that what we saw in the 2020 election was just record-breaking turnout. So we do have a highly mobilized voter population right now. On both the conservative and the liberal side, white women continued to support Trump. It even increased to 2020. So more women voted for Trump overall, 44%, and more white women voted for Trump than in 2016. So that went up. And we've also seen recent increases in the mobilization of women to violence. So women represent so far 15% of those arrested for the January 6th insurrection attack on the U.S. Capitol, which is, remarkably high compared to the role of women in other far-right extremist kind of mobilizations or violent efforts. And we just haven't seen anything like that before. And so I think there are lots of explanations for that I'm happy to talk about, much of which has to do with QAnon and the role of women, increasing engagement of women in conspiracy theories that were mobilized on that day. But we also saw women at the leadership of at least one of the militias, the unlawful militias who were there. One of the women, of course, who was killed right in the Capitol. So there are a lot of things that were going on that are just related to QAnon and the conspiracy theories. And so we're seeing, and I think we will continue to see, more women feeling empowered to engage in the violent mobilization as well. So I will stop there so that we have plenty of time for question and answer. And we can go back to Francis.
Yes. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for this presentation. We'll give Peter a short second to catch his breath, because I think that was a real challenge for him. Thank you so much for your presentation and also for your paper. I think it's so insightful and so important as to me from a German, a more European point of view. There were some points that were maybe not so available for us within the discussion we have here in the media. I'd like to highlight some points, and then we can also rely on the questions from the chat. You talked again about the framework, what different frames of references were important for the success of Trump. And I think within the report, you also speak about Trumpism. Of course, within academia, we tend to have new new themes or new words for phenomenons all the time. But I think Trumpism is really something that is going to stick. And since you also use it, could you maybe explain a little bit what Trumpism actually means for you?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So Trumpism is a term that really refers to the political trends that led to Trump's election that reflects four things. It's a celebrity, so an aspect of celebrity, kind of almost a embrace of a particular person as a hero. I mean, as really a like the love that people have for him. The signs, the fanhood, the merchandise, the hats, the flags. That kind of celebrity. So that's the first thing. The second is just populism, which is the positioning the elite against the ordinary people. His promise is to drain the swamp and to really, promise that the ordinary people have a role to play, and arguing, what we have in the States are often people call it's the coastal elites versus what the middle of the country say they feel. Flyover country, right? Flyover. Nobody wants to spend time in the middle, in that sense that they're being disrespected and disregarded by elites who live on the coasts mostly. So it's that celebrity, it's the populism. The third thing is nativism, which is really more the anti-immigrant and pro-nationalist kind of attitude. And then the fourth is unpredictable leadership. And I think that, so not the kind of steady state predictability that you see, but really making constant headlines, constant blunders in the news. And those four things are kind of, people seem to embrace, right? And that I think, even if it goes away, I think, even if the person goes away, that phenomenon, the importance of those four things and that peculiar blend endures.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think also the other parts you speak about, maybe they are not directly transferable to other countries, but I think that we can actually see also in other countries comparable modes of activism, modes of, you talked about spaces for just activism. And I think that the US is one example of that, but there are many more. Also, if I think about the Evangelical Christianity you mentioned, that's also a very, very global movement. We can also see how Evangelical Christianity was vital for Brazil and is also very active in Asia. Is there always this connotation of evangelical Christianity and gender roles and anti-feminist notions? Is it always connected?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know if it's always connected, but I know that it's plays a very strong role in the States. And I think that it's the way I think of it is, we think of it as anti-feminist, but I think within evangelical Christianity, it's a reframing of feminism and a claiming of the mantle of feminism, and a sense that there is a place for agency as traditional homemakers, for example, which, I think to understand it as empowering even. And that's, I think even in the extreme far right, which I think we'll talk about later, one of the trends we've seen with the shift to a lot of online engagement for the far right is that women play a more active role. And in many odd ways, they don't have to engage with the misogyny of men as much within their own movement if they're not, they might not have wanted to go out to the backwoods militia, and be around a bunch of men, but they can engage in a YouTube channel in a much more empowering way, create an Instagram channel. So I think we have to see it not just as anti-feminist, but as that women in the conservative and evangelical communities, and even in the extreme far right, have found spaces for empowerment. And so what we tend to think of as empowerment on the left, let's say, is not necessarily the only way that you can have empowerment as a woman, and that has been part of the mobilizing factor. And so, I think it's just an interesting thing that we have to unpack is what is it about the left's approach to feminism that made a lot of women feel excluded and find new spaces to reclaim that a sense of inclusion for their own ideas and frames about being a woman, that then led to voting against their interest in terms of voting in ways that actually reduce their rights. So it's a paradox and a contradiction in its own way. But I think if you understand it as finding a space of empowerment also, that can kind of explain some of it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in changing the perspective and thinking about anti-feminism as being just also a rational train of thought. And that's really challenging, but I totally see what you're saying. I'd like to touch a little bit more about where the US is right now. You already told us that you had to submit your report shortly after the presidential election, and you had only a little bit of time to go back to the report and put some little things in. But I would like to take us a little bit back. Since January, we have seen a noticeable change in US policy, I think. starting with, of course, a serious vaccination program, with also, I think we can also witness a different tone in foreign relations. And also the infrastructure program was also discussed a little bit within the German media. So from the outside, from a European perspective, it really seems that President Biden and Vice President Harris seem to be very successful. But to what extent have they already rolled back these anti-feminist policies you also talked about? And to add to that, do you see any signs actually of healing within the US society? Healing, the notion of healing was something that President Biden talked about during the campaign, and also I think also within his inaugural address. I think it's a tad emotional, but could you comment on that? Did the US society already heal, and what are the policies at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the overwhelming focus of the new administration right now has been on the coronavirus vaccine rollout, and a little bit on the post-January 6th attention to domestic violent extremism. And so they are quietly rolling back and changing. And I think already I've seen, the biggest changes, I would say, in terms of women's issues so far have been the restoration of a lot of and not just restoration, but creation of new policies. I mean, the food insecurity issues have been very high during the pandemic, for example. And I saw that the numbers dropped by 1/3, an entire 30% reduction in the number of people reporting that they're hungry in just the month of March alone. So that's because of Biden administration policies to more quickly get aid out to people. And so, I don't know about how rapidly they've overturned some of those other policies, but I know that there are changes happening very quickly that they're focused on in terms of getting aid out to people and getting, related to the COVID-19 pandemic and to people having lost their jobs and the economy being in turmoil and that kind of thing. So I think there are certain kinds of things there that have been very successful and are changing. But I would say the things I'm worried about, I don't think there's been any kind of healing yet. I think that we remain extraordinarily polarized. And in the most recent polls that I've seen just from this past week, a Reuters poll showed that 55% of Republicans still falsely believe that there was election rigging and illegal voting, and that's why Biden won. And 60% of Republicans believe still incorrectly that the election was stolen from Trump. So, we still have a majority of Republicans in the country who believe that the election was illegal, illegitimate, who do not trust the democratic or electoral process. And now we have pretty significant engagement among Republicans at the state level to try to make it harder to vote in ways that I think, as we've seen with the protests in Georgia, with the, protests about voter restrictions that are coming down. And so in really undemocratic ways that could, though, still have quite an impact on the 2024 election. So I think we continue to see a very polarized society, and one that still has completely different views, even about the legitimacy of the election.
Yeah, I think there are also some questions regarding this aspect, but let me just add, you talked a lot about mainstreaming of anti-feminist notions during the presidency of Donald Trump. I could only imagine that what Biden calls healing, he would, or basically, I think that means to de-mainstream anti-feminist notions. But I can only imagine from an academical point of view how hard it must be to really roll this mainstreaming effect back. you are actually head of an institution that tries to come up with evidence-based preventative and intervention measures. What would you recommend? Do you have any idea what should we do to push back?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we have, most of what we do is test, in my research lab, we test interventions that try to come at this almost through a media literacy lens to help people understand what propaganda looks like, what misinformation looks like, how techniques, persuasive extremist techniques like scapegoating or fear-mongering work, in terms of really being effective at persuading people about things that are not true, including conspiracy theories. So we have, for example, just finished, we haven't published it yet, but we should in about 2 or 3 weeks, I hope. We finished a study on interventions to combat male supremacy, which are a set of beliefs that are, clearly anti-feminist, that set up hierarchies of superiority and inferiority between men and women, that often are very ubiquitous in youth cultural spaces online, including through the sharing of memes that are policing women's sexual behavior, for example, and that often act as a gateway to other kinds of extremist thinking, like white supremacist extremism. So we have been working in, and Peter, I'm sorry if this is hard to translate, it's called inoculation research. It's the idea here is that it works like a vaccine. You inoculate people against the misinformation itself by showing them how the propaganda works. And so it's the idea of it. We're doing it with video-based inoculation, where you create a video that warns people that there is propaganda out there, that it's persuasive, that really smart people fall for it, and encourages them not to fall for it, and gives them examples like a microdose way of a vaccine. And so we have good evidence showing that approach works. It comes from public health research that shows, for example, that, there's a really great research study that shows that after decades of trying to teach young people about the long-term consequences of bad eating habits, right? So they're going to have problems with their cholesterol or whatever else later in life if they don't make changes. Based on the facts, it had zero impact on the choices that they make today as teenagers. But when researchers created a curriculum that taught them about how fast food companies were profiting off of their choices that were not in their own interest, they were manipulating them to make choices that were against their own interest for healthy bodies. That changed youth behaviors more. And in fact, it changed the behaviors of boys more than girls. So the idea is they started to make healthier eating choices because they didn't like the idea that they're being manipulated. And so we take an approach that tries to do the same thing, that shows how propaganda works and how persuasive it can be. So we have a large project on anti-vax inoculation videos, for example, but, that is really trying to show how manipulative some of even with the music or the colors in the videos or propaganda, that you can really be persuaded by something that's not in your own interest. And so we're doing that. We do have the results for combating male supremacist propaganda that way. And the results show that it worked, that watching the video for a sample of about 800 people did reduce their support for the propaganda. And it did make them question the integrity of the source. So they become more skeptical about the source itself, which is a good thing, meaning less trusting of the group that produced the propaganda. So those are the kinds of approaches that we are taking, which is arguing that you have to try to teach everybody in the mainstream how to better recognize misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, rather than just try to address it only in the fringe. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's what we've been working on in the lab.
Yes, perfectly. And I think it's so insightful also for political education foundations like the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung to know that just to spread knowledge is sometimes not enough, but you really have to talk about the functionalities, how people are attracted by conspiracy theories and so on. There's one question from the chat that I'd like to raise right now, and it's about you already talked a little bit about litigation and laws that have been passed. Here's a question about I think a recent law in Arkansas. It's an anti-transgender and anti reproductional rights. Are those laws already in place, or can they still be stopped? I think also in your report you talk a little bit about the long-term effects of Donald Trump because he was able to place so many judges, and maybe that's also like a little bit connected to this question. What are the possibilities of stopping this law?
Yeah, the laws, I have to look up each individual state. There's so many changes happening so rapidly. I'm not sure about Arkansas, and also Alabama, I know has had recent changes. Whether they have taken effect yet or not. They will, I'm sure, be challenged in court. And so I don't think that, we've seen the end of this yet. But as Franziska just mentioned, I talked about in the report, Trump has appointed so many federal judges across the country. It's really astonishing when you look at the numbers, and as well as on the Supreme Court. I mean, those have a generational impact, because these are lifetime appointments or long-term appointments at least. It was a strategy that really has an impact for many years beyond this one administration. And so, particularly because a lot of them are young. And so, when you're seeing people appointed in their 40s to a lifetime appointment, they could be there for 30 years or more. And so we saw that, just with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the fall, and the very quick mobilization to get that appointment through before the election. So I think, I do think that we'll see challenges, but I'm not sure what's going to happen with those challenges, given the changes in the, both in the Supreme Court and in the federal courts, as well as in state courts across the country. So I do think we're entering an era in the states where we're going to see, we're already seeing real stepping back, particularly from reproductive rights, to an era of many more restrictions in the next few decades, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'd like to touch on one more point that you already raised. Let's turn to the insurrection. It was, of course, a very scarring moment in US history. It was one of those 21st century historic events that we were actually able to follow more or less live on TV and through social media. I remember Knut Detlissen, the head of the FES office in Washington. He was more or less live streaming and live commenting about what was happening. And of course, just a few days after this horrific event, we saw the impeachment fail. We saw then a very uplifting inauguration and a new president, the first female Black vice president, this kind of change of energy. You already mentioned during the insurrection, there was a relatively high number of women among the insurrectionists. What do we actually know about them by now? Because I saw every day there are new reports coming out about who was involved. And today there was something about the FBI and the Washington police who knew what and who said what to whom at what time. So maybe you could inform us a little bit about the women that were involved.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating question, and I feel like this issue will, it's so hard to analyze something like this right now when we don't yet know, is this going to historically be, an exception to, or is it one moment among many? What is the next year or 2 or 3 years going to look like? I feel like we'll look back on this and be able to say in a few years with much greater depth. But what we do know is that 15% of those arrested so far are women. That is at least 10% more. Normally we see about 5% nationally, or less of any kind of far right extremism on the violent side engaged by women. So that is a much higher number. And not only were there more women there, but they were older women. So we're not, we also usually see youth predominantly involved in the violence, but there were like several pairs of mothers and sons who were there. There were women in the Capitol who kind of were like grandmothers or grandmother's age, at least, and that several couples, who were there. So it was a really different event. It wasn't just people mobilizing. And part of that is because we had, this is where it depends on the sort of two major sets of kinds of people at the Capitol. There was the organized and militant far-right scene. And then there were the, who planned and came with tactical gear and, communications channels and plans to try to, get into the Capitol and execute a plan to potentially kidnap or, pull out Democratic lawmakers even. No one knows exactly what could have happened. And then there was the kind of mobilized mob of spontaneously organized people. And there's some overlap between that. I mean, I think of the mobilized mob as the people who, didn't come with weapons necessarily or tactical gear, but they had, they turned fire extinguishers into weapons or flagpoles into weapons. But we also know there were some of those people, one was wearing a bulletproof vest, for example, even though he was in that mobilized mob. So they maybe anticipated some kind of violence that day, even if it wasn't exactly the plan to storm the Capitol. They thought maybe they'd be attacked by anti-fascist activists or something like that. But the militant side had, tactical plans and they were also represented by the white supremacist extremist fringe, as well as the unlawful militia and anti-government extremist fringe. So, and you had women at every level, right? So we had women there who were, really in the leadership of the militia side, which is unusual and we had not really seen before. And then you had a lot of women on the mobilized Trump voters and also in the QAnon side. And so I would say probably the number one thing that led to the involvement of so many women is QAnon. We are seeing far more women mobilized into QAnon and that conspiracy theory than we usually have seen before. And QAnon is not just a right wing conspiracy theory. It's drawing people across the spectrum, which is it's messy and it's confusing, but we see a lot of women drawn into QAnon through the wellness community. For example, like through yoga even. They are coming in through groups that have a traditional or a view against traditional medicine and sort of a distrust of government authorities in general. And then that kind of creates a receptivity to some of the anti-government conspiracy theories that circulate. Also some intersections with the anti-vax movement that also distrusts, traditional government or traditional medicine. And so what we saw there was sort of women mobilized through this big conspiracy theory and then through the Stop the Steal dynamic that obviously was a successful mass misinformation campaign that really led people to believe that they were called upon to act heroically to thwart a a tyrannical threat to the nation. So, a lot of these people really felt that they were the ones being heroic. And when you see that, majority of Republicans still believe the election was stolen, 60% believe the election was illegitimate, then, you understand that a lot of these people really were mobilized out of that belief and felt that they were stopping an illegitimate election. And so it makes sense that women were a part of that too, particularly given the history of more conservative women's mobilization in the years leading up to Trump. So I think we are going to continue to see more women mobilizing. They've been empowered in different ways, and we're having this much messier spectrum of engagement around the conspiracy theories compared to traditional ideological engagement. I mean, QAnon is hard to wrap your head around, but obviously also growing overseas as well. I know that there's quite a lot of conspiracy thinking in Germany and elsewhere. So,
yeah, exactly. I think what you just said is also it also relates to the main point you make with your book, with Hate in the Homeland, where you say for a long time we were thinking about the far right, or academia was thinking about the far right to explain the how and why, and you are raising the question of where and when, and that's exactly what you were now explaining. It's the mobilization. How do people get connected to those kinds of ideas, to those kinds of ideologies? There is another question from the chat, and it stems from another contradiction, or what seems to be a contradiction. The question is, more and more women are part of violent right-wing mobilization, and at the same time we can see this kind of glorification of traditional female housewife roles. How does that connect?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of contradictions here, but I think, so going back to that Tea Party mobilization of women, which was that it was precisely the localization of political activism that enabled more conservative women who are homemakers to mobilize. And I think that we've seen that throughout 2020 with the shelter-in-place protests at state capitals, that those were local kind of engagements as well. Even if people had to drive a couple of hours to get to a state capitol, it wasn't the same as, flying across the country to get to the U.S. Capitol. So that localization has sort of helped mobilize people. And I think that, I think it's hard to underestimate the role of these online spaces in especially over the last year, in making women in particular feel there were ways to engage that had previously been excluded to them, and so if these spaces had both at the national political level been dominated by men and on the extremist fringe been dominated by men in really misogynistic ways as well, where women didn't feel maybe comfortable being a part of, or, they were the helpers who sewed the Ku Klux Klan hoods, as people always point out, it's been pointed out by others, but they weren't actively invited to be a part of or engage in those, extremist fringe groups. And because they were also very patriarchal and misogynistic. And so these online spaces have created entire new ways for women to be leaders, to encourage other women, and to create women-specific kind of channels for engagement on the extreme fringe, like Instagram channels, things that are very aesthetically in line with a lot of other popular trends, but then they're sharing white supremacist extremist content instead of whatever else they would be sharing on Instagram, or cooking channels, or other kinds of ways that connect through hobbies, as I talk about in my book. So I think, that's on the extreme fringe. In the kind of more mobilization of the conservative mainstream, I think that we just have seen a year in which people are, isolated at home, spending way too much time online, very susceptible to a lot of the, additional propaganda and conspiracy theories that have also been circulating. A lot of people, the way we understand QAnon engagement as well is that people feel very out of control in their lives. And this conspiracy theory, Americans have always liked conspiracy theories, I think more than the rest of the world. But, conspiracy theories offer people a sense of black and white explanation for things that are really difficult for them to absorb and process. So, it was very difficult for Americans to accept the assassination of John F. Kennedy, for example, and there still are an endless number of conspiracy theories that say he's alive or who was a part of that assassination or killing. And I think it gives people more of a sense of control. And so you can see women's engagement in some of the QAnon as empowering in the sense of, what you hear in interviews is they'll say, like, they really felt compelled because there are children involved and they want to stop a child trafficking ring, and they didn't feel they had anything else that they could have done. They had to engage in stopping this child trafficking ring. So it's back to that issue of mobilizing women based on some of those traditional roles as mothers, as homemakers, but in a way that offers them a sense of action, of purpose, of meaning, a way to enact control over their lives at a moment when there has been very little control over people's lives in the shutdowns and pandemics and the kind of grief of now over 550,000 people dying too. So, it's not an excuse for the behavior, but I'm explaining kind of how I think it is that women have been drawn into the QAnon conspiracy theory in particular, which then intersected with the Stop the Steal narrative and positioned Trump, of course, as sort of the ultimate, like, coming back. He'll still be restored as president. He's still the true president. They still keep believing there'll be a real inauguration at some time. And so it's a conspiracy theory that's bigger than Trump, but that clearly intersected around that moment with Trump. So that's sort of a rambling explanation, but I think it's not as contradictory as it seems on the surface, because if you think of it as a way of for women to enact a sense of engagement and purpose, that they really felt that they were being heroic, then it makes a little bit more sense.
It does. Just for everyone that maybe joined in later, I would say hello and extend also a very warm welcome to everyone who joined us now on YouTube or via the website of the FES. We already had a little presentation from Cynthia Miller-Idriss about her report that is also available on the same website you are now watching and listening to. So now, coming back to another question from the chat. And this goes a little bit back to how voters were drawn to vote for former President Trump. The question reads like this. Could one say that there is a correlation between voting behavior of white women and black men when it comes to Trump or Trumpism in general, because they are mostly not targeted intersectionally? So they are not targeted as more than being black men, not being targeted as a worker or as a dad or as in form of different roles. Would you say there is a correlation in that sense between white women and black men?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I had not thought about it before. But I think, I guess if you extend the logic that I argued about white women protecting some of their privilege, as white people relative to women of minority status, maybe there is an argument to be made that, non-white men would be also protecting their male privilege in some way, and so that there's that people are voting with one aspect in mind of their own identity. So I had not thought about it, but I think, you know, for me, it's the issue of the racialized party loyalty around how women vote is what I have mostly been thinking about, which is that that Black and Latina women do overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, and white women have historically voted for Republicans. So it is, I think, bigger and longer than the history of what happened in this particular election or the last two elections. And one of the questions I have, you know, always wondered in my own head is, you know, would it have been different if it wasn't Hillary Clinton? You know, if it was another candidate, if it was another woman candidate even, who wasn't received by so many conservative women as a direct affront to their own sense of identity, as particularly for women who are homemakers, who were really kind of offended by that long history of blunders that she had. So I don't know the question to that. So in other words, it's hard to know. There's no way to rewrite history with a different candidate, but it's difficult to know how much of that particular vote was anti-Hillary at that time. Again, though, what we do see in 2020 is that their portion of the vote even increased, and so even after 4 years of Trump, you know, 55% of white women voted for him again. So in that sense, I guess if you just compare those two, that anti-Hillary vote wasn't as much of a factor as perhaps it initially seemed.
Thank you. Another question that comes from the chat goes back to, you talked about the mobilization via certain debates, and the debate pro-life versus pro-choice. Is that actually a debate that is specific to gender? Is there a point being made that pro-life versus pro-choice is something that mobilizes women, or is it does it also extend to men?
Oh, I think it definitely mobilizes women and men. I think that it is in many ways the fulcrum, like the focal point for evangelical Christian support for Republican candidates and for Trump in particular, is the promise to defund Planned Parenthood, the attacks on, and then, you know, to have that global gag rule stated just on the first day of office, I think makes it very clear that the response was consistent with what they wanted and what they were hoping would happen. So, I mean, it is really interesting that issue becomes such a central focal point for evangelicals. But I think it is even more than these ideas of restoration of, you know, the anger or offense taken by gendered pronouns or transgender rights. Really, all is secondary, I would say, to the abortion issue and to the reproductive rights issues particularly for evangelicals, but also for a lot of conservative Republicans across the board. So I would absolutely expect it to be mobilizing both for men and for women. I think the reason why it's, you know, it gets back to that Sayward Darby quote about why would women organize against their own interests, because it seems, you know, difficult if these are rights that women, you know, have that are being restricted or taken away. That's the way I think it's seen from the left or from the pro-choice movement. But for the evangelical Christians, where there's this very strong sacred and profane distinction of good and evil, and abortion falls into the evil side of it, you know, where it's really seen as the taking of a life and as being completely against their belief systems. It becomes this organizing concept. So I think it's hard to underestimate how central it is for both men and for women. I would agree.
Mm-hmm. Finally, I would like to shed some light on the interaction of anti-feminism and the COVID-19 pandemic. You already talked a little bit about the spread of conspiracy theories, and I think maybe especially, or maybe it's more of a transnational phenomenon, but in Germany, we can very obviously see how right-wing extremists and anti-government movements join forces and are now demonstrating against COVID-19 measures that are in place. And this is oftentimes accompanied by a spread of conspiracy theories and arguably also a new form of mainstreaming of conspiracy theories. Before you talked a bit about how people were also mobilized through new spaces. You talked about the yoga studios and anti-vaccination groups, and I think that is also that pinpoints it very well also for the German debate. And just to come back to the question, I think in Germany we can see that, of course, anti-Semitic ideas have been much more obvious within those kind of demonstrations, but there are also some very striking anti-feminist references. Do you see that in the US as well? Is there also an interaction between anti-feminism and the pandemic, or how the society reacts to measures that are in place just to be safer, to get the vaccination out, to have a mask on? There were some really ridiculous demonstrations in Germany showing us how conspiracy theories are spreading right now, and how they're anti-Semitic but also anti-feminist notions. So I was just wondering if that's also happening.
A really interesting question. I think, what I've seen is that the COVID-19 pandemic itself has mobilized women. I mean, so there's two different major effects, I would say here. So I'm not sure about the anti-feminist nature in the conspiracy theory or the protests, although now I want to go dig back into this because I'm very curious to see if I've overlooked it. But what I have seen is, on the one hand, more women being mobilized into the conspiracy theories themselves, and often through the rhetoric of, I think people call it even pastel QAnon, like this kind of softer engagement in conspiracy theories, often through these wellness movements and communities and their intersections, as I mentioned before, with the anti-vax movement. We also have seen more women mobilized into the anti-shelter-in-place or shutdown protests. And for some reason, there have been several journalistic articles about this, often around the idea of haircuts, which is really interesting, like this idea that they're not allowed to have a haircut because the hair salons have closed down. And so you hear that from a lot of women, that somehow their freedom to get a haircut has been restricted, and that is unacceptable. So on the one hand, there are those kinds of things going on, which I would say is I've seen it more as a mobilizing effect. But we also have had, a generation really of impact now on women through the pandemic. So far more women have lost their jobs than men, and also the caregiving burdens on women because schools have been closed almost everywhere. Preschools closed, childcare options have been very thin, and so the numbers of women who have, just even in my own field in academia, there's regularly data coming out now showing, for example, that men's productivity in submission of articles has even gone up under the pandemic, but women's has gone way down. And so we have seen it varies a little bit for different fields, but that women have shouldered the majority of the burden of having young children at home in ways that will probably affect tenure and promotion decisions in academia and affect them for generations to come. So I think that there's sort of those two somewhat contradictory trends happening. One, more engagement of women politically on the conservative side, but also on the extreme side and on the conspiracy side, and then more restrictions or loss of progress, I guess, on the employment side, and the numbers of women who just have quit their jobs because they weren't able, either lost their jobs or resigned from their jobs because they weren't able to deal with the childcare burdens over the past year. So that's really unclear what kind of restoration there will be of those employment numbers, or what will happen as children start to go back to school here. It's still nowhere near where a normal school enrollments would be. Maybe in September we'll start to see some full-time enrollment, and then we'll get a better sense of, do women go back to work, or they lost career opportunities. So that's a bit of a tangent, but I think it has to do more with so not so much the anti-feminist rhetoric, although that may be there as well, but the real differential impact on women's opportunities, I guess, is what I would say is the major thing I've seen over the past year in the US.
Yeah, but that's certainly also true for Germany.
Mm-hmm.
I was, when I was thinking about this question, for example, what came to mind was some kind of notion, and there were posters and all this stuff about, again, attacks on gender studies. They were kind of saying, well, now you see all these research on women and how many genders they may be. What did it help us now?
Yeah.
It's really interesting how during a broader discussion about what are the right responses to this really global pandemic, one can come back to an attack on gender studies, but that kind of stuck to me, and that's why I was interested in raising this question. All right, Cynthia, thank you so much for this extended talk. I know you got your second vaccination yesterday and you're feeling a bit down, and I can also hear it in your voice.
Thank you. I am grateful to science, but yes, fever, a little bit of a fever, and happy that my immune system is responding. But yes, I hope that it came through anyway, and that everyone was able to understand.
I think everyone was able to understand. I thank you so much for your contribution as well in academia, as well as in so many different other ways you're contributing. I think the work at the lab is so fascinating, and it's so interesting to see how research and politics are getting intertwined, and how important it is to translate academic results, especially about far-right movements and anti-democratic notions into politics. That's so important, and I'm so thankful that you're doing that. Of course, I'd also like to thank everyone that was involved for tonight. Michael, Knut, and Peter, thank you so much for your help. Lastly, I would say, please go back to the report. You can see it on our website. There is this whole series of country studies. We will continue with another talk on the 12th of May, where we will discuss anti-feminism in Great Britain, in the UK. We already had a talk about Germany and Austria, which is still, I think, available on the Facebook page of FAS Thuringia. So if you're interested, please go back and watch the stream. And then just lastly, have a good night or have a good day wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining. Stay tuned for what the FES is doing, and of course also what Cynthia is up to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for listening. And be well, and I hope you all get the vaccine soon.
We hope so too, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia.